interesting. Thank you everyone for being here. Just a quick announcement. There's still people who are entering, so we'll start in a few minutes. So good evening, everyone. I think we are ready to get started. Welcome to our event, a panel discussion on atrocities, genocide, and the duty to prevent and to punish under international law, the situation of Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh. My name is Professor Ann Karagosian, and it is my privilege as the director of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA to welcome you to our campus. Those of you in person, and also welcome to our remote audiences who are watching on Zoom and on YouTube. Those of us in the Promise Armenian Institute, as well as those in our co-hosts institute, the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law, are honored that you have taken the time from your busy lives to listen and to participate in this important discussion on a subject that is so critical to those of us in the Armenian diaspora, in the long and poignant history, in fact, of the Armenian people. It is truly an honor for our UCLA-based institutes to be able to include such a distinguished lineup of speakers whose expertise ranges from law and human rights to United Nations and the prevention of genocide, to gender issues and human rights, to the history of the Armenian genocide in the early 20th century. They will be introduced more formally in a few minutes, but I would also like to thank our numerous co-sponsors for their support of this event. These include the UCLA Lachin Center for History and Policy, the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate, the UCLA Armenian Students Association, the University Network for Human Rights, Jewish World Watch, and the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, or NASR. We are grateful for the support and solidarity of all of our co-sponsors. The tiny region of Nagorno-Karabakh, or as it is known in Armenian, Artsakh, has been uppermost in the hearts and minds of those of us in the diaspora in recent years, especially since the full-scale war attack initiated by Azerbaijan in September of 2020, in which thousands of lives on both sides were lost. And since the tenuous ceasefire agreement mediated by Russia, but irregularly maintained by Russian peacekeepers at the Lachin Corridor, which runs between Armenia and what remained of autonomous Artsakh. This tenuous peace agreement of November 2020 was even further strained, as most of you know, beginning in December of 2022 by the complete blockage of the Lachin Corridor, first by self-described Azerbaijani environmentalists and then by the Azeri government itself, resulting in a full-scale humanitarian crisis with extremely limited access to Artsakh, allowed even to the International Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations. Deprivations in food, medicine, medical care, and even basic services gave way 2 months ago to a complete prohibition of all transport of goods and humanitarian relief on the Lachin Corridor. This clear violation of basic human rights over 9 months, an active starvation of the indigenous Armenians of Artsakh over 2 months, led many experts, including the first chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Luis Moreno Ocampo, to declare that the actions of the Azeri government against the Armenian people of Nagorno-Karabakh were tantamount to a run-up to genocide. The blockade of the Lachin Corridor and the ensuing humanitarian crisis was in fact the original subject of this panel discussion as we were planning it several months ago. But tragically, on September 19, 2023, just a few days after formal hearings on the Lachin Corridor crisis were held in the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee and in a special session of the United Nations Security Council, Azerbaijan launched a unilateral military attack against the already suffering Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh, resulting in the loss of hundreds of lives, the injury, violation, and maiming of hundreds more, and eventually the near complete ethnic cleansing of indigenous Armenians from their ancestral homeland of Artsakh, with over 100,000 children, women, and men escaping in less than a week's period into the Republic of Armenia. At this moment in time, many ethnic Armenians, some of them former leaders in the Artsakh government, have been arrested by Azerbaijan for the crime of daring to serve the people who have lived in this region of the world for over 2 millennia. And this includes David Babayan, who actually spoke in this room a little over a year ago to our audience at UCLA. As most of you are aware, such abrupt and unprovoked attacks on unsuspecting civilians were replicated in part just a few days ago by the militant group Hamas against Israeli civilians living near the Gaza Strip. But in fact, such horrific violence has been perpetrated by other groups in the past on civilian populations, culminating in many cases in wholesale genocide. Such suffering is not unique to Armenians or to Jews or to other ethnic and religious groups, but hate is among the common denominators of the perpetrators of such violence. In no uncertain terms, as our UCLA Chancellor, Jean Block, so eloquently stated yesterday, we express our horror and condemnation of these violent actions against civilians who are merely living out their lives. So for this event, we are especially grateful to our distinguished speakers and to our moderator, Hannah Gary, for their flexibility as we slightly altered the title and the emphasis in our panel in a more tragic direction in response to the horrifying events in Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh in particular. We look forward to an informative, helpful, and perhaps even hopeful discussion and exchange of views. And now, before we move on with our program and formal introductions, let me mention just a few procedural types of matters. First, let me note that this event is being recorded for future viewing on our UCLA Promise Armenian Institute YouTube channel and accessible from the Promise Institute for Human Rights website as well. Second, after our panel presentations and discussions with our moderator, we ask that questions be offered by our in-person audience members by your writing them on the 3x5 cards that you received when you entered the auditorium. These will be collected by our staff and they will be presented to our speakers, and we will hope to offer as many questions as are practical. For those of you watching on the Zoom webinar platform, if you have a question, please just type it into the Q&A, and we will again try to get to as many questions as are practical. And third, let me note that when the presentations and the question and answer period is completed, those of you who are here in person are welcome to join us for light refreshments in our lobby after the event. Finally, importantly, and on behalf of the co-sponsors here at UCLA, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the indigenous Gabrielino Tongva peoples. It is a privilege for our institution to acknowledge the history of the land on which we are established. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the moderator of this evening's panel, Professor Hannah Gary. Professor Gary is the newly installed Executive Director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law School. She is a scholar and professor of international criminal law at UCLA and is on the Faculty Advisory Committee of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. Originally established by Steven Spielberg to archive testimony of survivors of genocide. Prior to UCLA Law, she taught at the USC Gould School of Law for 13 years. She has practiced as a senior legal advisor and amicus curiae in cases involving genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity for nearly 20 years, including cases before the International Criminal Court, the Yugoslav Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal, and the Cambodia Tribunal. In 2022, she was a U.S. Fulbright Scholar at the Pluricourt Center at the University of Oslo Law. Together with experts from the University of Oxford and University of Toronto, she filed a communique alleging crimes against humanity in Cameroon with the ICC's Office of the Prosecutor in 2022. So we're delighted to welcome Hannah to UCLA, to welcome her here as our partner in organizing this event. And so Hannah, I will now turn the event over to you and to introduce our speakers and have our two in-person speakers join us here.
All right, can everyone hear me okay? Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Karagosian, and for that kind introduction. And yes, please welcome to the stage our distinguished panelists. I really want to echo what you said in terms of just saying a deep thanks to our co-sponsors for this event, especially the Promise Armenian Institute, and for all the efforts that went into its organization. Thanks to all of you. As you know, and as you've just heard, the focus of our event tonight is on the unfolding atrocity situation resulting from Azerbaijan's recent attack and seizure of Nagorno-Karabakh on September 19th, resulting in multiple deaths and injuries and destruction of civilian property and massive forced displacement in a very short period of time. As Anne already mentioned, when we first started planning this event 2 months ago, the focus was going to be on the blockade of the Lachin Corridor and on the duty to prevent atrocities and genocide under international law. We were gravely concerned about the blockade for around 300 days, resulting in a humanitarian crisis, and wanted to focus on the duty to prevent just because as an international criminal law lawyer and professor, I was noticing and seeing alongside many other experts, lots of red flags and classic signs of, genocidal intent and impending genocide. And so we wanted to focus on that. Unfortunately, our grave concerns came to fruition within the last 2 months, and the world has witnessed and largely stood silently by as over 100,000 ethnic Armenians, 25% of them children, fled Nagorno-Karabakh into Armenia in terrible condition. And this ethnic cleansing was predictable, not only because of the hundreds of days of blockade of the Lachin Corridor, but because of events preceding that, back to the 44-day Second Nagorno-Karabakh War in 2020 and attacks on Armenia in 2022, and unchecked discrimination and persecution of ethnic Armenians for decades. Impunity for such discrimination, persecution, and violations has led to further violence. As such, while we still will discuss then tonight the duty to prevent, our shift in focus now is on also the responsibility of states to punish and to prosecute and for there to be accountability. Our emphasis will be on such because accountability for crimes is in itself, of course, a form of prevention and of breaking a cycle of violence. These are indeed grave, dark times, as Anne mentioned, for many groups around the world, and also for ethnic Armenians world over, with echoes of the genocide suffered in 1915. We at the Promise Institute for Human Rights stand in solidarity with the refugees and all of the pain that has resulted from the latest aggressions, and pledge that we'll work towards accountability in the coming days and will not look away, and will raise our voices and demand that silence and inaction by world leaders come to an end. And it is our hope that this evening with this discussion with our distinguished experts, we can help shed some light on the situation and understanding that will lead to further efforts for justice, accountability, and an end to the violence. Before I turn now to introduce our distinguished panelists and moderate a discussion on the duty to prevent and the duty to punish, I would like to ask for a moment that we just all pause As I was writing up my remarks, I was thinking and reflecting on the situation and what is happening and what the refugees are experiencing at the moment. And I would just like for all of us to pause in a moment of silence and offer up our thoughts and our prayers for the many forcibly displaced who are now suffering in Armenia, for their families and all those who are working to assist them. So if you just take a moment with me, please. Thank you. So now am deeply honored and grateful to our 4 panelists who are joining us this evening and who have agreed to lend their expertise and engage with us in this discussion. And I'd like to introduce each of them briefly, and then we'll pose a series of questions on a number of topics, starting first with focus on the current facts on the ground in Armenia following the events and the attack on Nagorno-Karabakh. And then also questions around what atrocity crimes, what human rights abuses we are seeing under international law in the current context. And then take a look at and discuss what are the actual prevention obligations under international law, and what are the tools available for intervention. And then finally, talk about the duty to hold alleged perpetrators accountable. So first, we have over to my far left, Dr. Taner Acham, who is the inaugural director, Armenian Genocide Research Program at the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA. Dr. Acham grew up in Turkey, where he was imprisoned for editing a political youth journal and was subsequently adopted as a prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International in 1976. He later received political asylum in Germany. And in 1996, he earned his doctorate from the University of Hanover. Dr. Acham is widely recognized as one of the first Turkish scholars to write extensively on the Ottoman Turkish genocide of the Armenians in the early 20th century. And he is the author of more than 10 scholarly works, as well as numerous articles on the Armenian genocide and Turkish nationalism. Next on Zoom, we have Professor Thomas Becker, who is joining us, who teaches at Columbia Law School, as well as Wesleyan University. Welcome, Thomas. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, wonderful, welcome. Thomas is the Legal and Policy Director at the University Network for Human Rights and has worked on human rights issues for 2 decades in Bolivia, where he was part of the legal team that held 7 government officials accountable for genocide in the Bolivian Supreme Court. Most recently, he's been part of leading students on fact-finding missions in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, including students from UCLA this past summer, resulting in a briefing on the Lachin Corridor blockade and a letter that analyzed the risk factors for genocide that was submitted to the UN Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide. He also submitted an op-ed during the crisis in Times Magazine. And then also coming and joining us by Zoom, we have behind me Professor Juan Mendez. Welcome, Professor Mendez.
Thank you.
Professor Mendez teaches human rights law at American University, Washington College of Law, as well as Oxford University. And previously, he has served as the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, as an advisor on international crimes and prevention of international crimes for the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, as the inaugural UN Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide, among many other accolades. On August 23rd, 2023, Professor Mendez issued a preliminary opinion on the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh and on the need for the international community to adopt measures to prevent atrocity crimes there. And finally, and importantly, it's an honor to hear from our 4th distinguished panelist, Ms. Sheila Paylan, who comes all the way from Yerevan to join us today. She's widely known as an expert in international criminal law, human rights, and gender, and was former legal advisor to the United Nations across countries and regions for more than 15 years, And just as a side note, she and I had the pleasure of working together at the Cambodia Tribunal. She regularly consults for a number of international organizations, NGOs, think tanks, and governments, and has published extensively on the subjects of international justice, self-determination, and the responsibility to protect. So with that, I think you will agree that we have quite an august body of experts with us. Please join me in welcoming them today. Great. Okay, so I'm going to kick us off with our discussion with a series of questions related to the current situation on the ground and how we might think about it in terms of the types of serious human rights abuses that have been perpetrated and whether they arise to what we call atrocity crimes under international law, the most serious human rights abuses, namely war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So Sheila, if it's all right with you, I'd like to turn to you first, as you are just coming from Armenia, and ask if you wouldn't mind giving us a bit of an update on the situation for refugees on the ground there since the attack on September 19th, and then the massive forced displacement in such a short period of time through the Lachin Corridor. What are you seeing in terms of the impact on ethnic Armenian refugees on the ground? And how is the host community coping?
Hi, thank you, Hannah. Thanks for having me. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. So, I mean, the situation on the ground at the moment is the refugees have found shelter. There were a couple of days where they were at the border town of Goris, like it was just packed and overflowing, but you know, the ICRC and organizations and the Armenian government really came together to try to place everybody in, you know, as acceptable or appropriate conditions as possible. And it's probably one of the most amazing group efforts, like national group efforts I've ever seen. Everything from food to bedding to beds to just trying to make sure that we could minimize the suffering of this enormous group of people that have just lost everything. And I don't think enough time has passed yet to fully be able to process or articulate how both they feel and we feel, you know. And it's not just the host community, like the entire Armenian diaspora and nation is suffering this event right now in a way that still hasn't really, I don't think we've processed it yet. But like 100,000 plus refugees it's a stunning thing to watch happen, for them to flow in, and they were welcomed and embraced so openly, so quickly. And in a certain sense, given, you know, watching from so close 9 months of them being slowly starved, there's a part of me and a part of us that's sort of sighs a little bit of relief. Like the kids are able to eat properly again. People have access to proper health care now again. It doesn't take away at all the horror of the loss that has just happened, and, you know, the deep sense of injustice that prevails. But there's I mean, the emergency part is over. Not entirely, you know, there are still people living in large groups, like without privacy, and in like a big school or a big gym, or depending. They've just sort of fanned out across the country. For the most part, they really don't want to live in the south or near the border. Many of these people have been displaced several times at this point, like at least 2 or 3 times, have seen 2 or 3 wars. They can't take it anymore, like you can tell. And I recently went to visit a school in Artsakh where 200-300 refugees were staying. And, you know, the conditions it's not what you see, let's say, in Sudan or something, where you've got millions of refugees living under tents. It's definitely a far cry from that, but still, every other person cries intermittently, like the tears are still flowing. And yeah, it's a mix of deep sadness, but also I think a lot of love. There's a lot of love, and it in a weird sense united the country at the moment. Like all hands are on deck to try to just, we don't have too many protests at the moment. It's more about trying to make sure that that we help each other get through this, and then get up, you know, dust ourselves off and keep going. Yeah, at the moment it's a bit like still shell shocked, but that's about it. Yeah, does that answer?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I've just been, it's been remarkable, the resiliency and how the community has come together to rally around this massive movement of people in Armenia. Thomas, if I could turn to you, you've been doing fact finding in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Armenia, since March of 2022, with several trips and talking to refugees or talking to individuals who've been forcibly displaced. And I would be curious to know if you could just share with us and summarize some of what you were hearing in terms of the serious abuses that people were telling you about, what you were documenting. I noted that in your briefing paper of August 2023, it was noted that the abuses documented in that kind of culminating briefing paper after a couple of years of several fact-finding trips, that they were not a string of unrelated rights, or of an unrelated violation of rights, excuse me. So could you tell us a bit more about, you know, what you meant by that? And again, just explain what you were seeing and hearing in your fact finding.
Absolutely. First, thank you so much for organizing this. Unfortunately, it's really important right now, as we know what's happening. Before I will say one thing. One, I met Sheila in a conference. We participated in a conference together in Yerevan some time ago. And I do want to emphasize something that she said, that certainly people are not necessarily living in tents, but I think that the fears are very real along the border. As she mentioned the school, I started thinking about a school that we had visited along the border, in which the students, the walls are filled with photos of cluster bombs, unexploded ordnances, other bombs that children can identify so they don't blow up. And the other thing on the walls were pictures that they'd drawn. So not of, I work mostly in Latin America, everybody draws pictures of Messi and soccer teams or rock climbing or climbing trees. There they drew pictures of Azerbaijani soldiers coming in and killing their families, burning their homes, burning their churches. So I think that the fear in these schools or along the border are very real. You know, one thing I want to highlight before I talk about kind of the cluster of abuses that we've noticed on the ground is something that I think is important for framing. Recently, well, following the 44-day war, and ever since then, I fear that the way that this has been framed is this kind of age-old conflict, this tit for tat. Azerbaijan carries out abuses, then Armenia does, and that it's this kind of very gray thing in which both sides are committing all these egregious abuses, and it's almost dismissed as, you know, Israel and Palestine. This is they've been fighting since the beginning of time and will fight till the end of time. And I think that's really does a disservice to victims and the narrative that's, or what's actually really happening on the ground. Something that we've seen through these, well, now 7 fact-finding trips on the ground, we currently have somebody on the ground as we speak, is that there have been widespread abuses carried out by Azerbaijan against ethnic Armenians. So these are not isolated events. These are not individual bad actors. We have seen rights abuses committed from the lowest on the food chain in the military to the highest on the food chain in the military, to the highest levels of the government, including the president. So these have been systematic rights abuses, and they've been institutionalized over the last several years. So what's taking place now, unfortunately, for those of us who've been on the ground, is not a surprise. I could spend the next several days talking about all the abuses we've documented. I'll go over just kind of a few of the violations that we have noticed or seen really extreme patterns of abuses, ranging from arbitrary detention. And this is arbitrary detention outside the scope of military operations. So this is detaining Armenian civilians who are tending their lands in Armenia, sovereign Armenia, and in Nagorno-Karabakh, to capturing Armenian soldiers through entrapment, where Azerbaijani soldiers say, you can pass through here, and then detaining them. And then after they're detained, there's myriad due process violations, spurious charges, coerced confessions or self-incriminating testimonies, lack of access to lawyers, interpreters, tribunals, impartial tribunals. And a lot of the folks that have been detained have been tortured. They've been repeatedly beaten for months at a time, electroshocked, put into stress positions, sleep deprivation. They've been forced to chant Karabakh is Azerbaijan and hail to the president Aliyev. And then Azerbaijani forces have shared these videos online. So those of us who've been following this for some time, these videos, unfortunately, are very easy to come across. Perhaps some of the most horrific things we've seen have been extrajudicial killings. One of the things that concerns us right now is following the 44-day war, following the ceasefire, those who did not flee the areas that were occupied by Azerbaijan generally were the sick and the elderly, and they were brutally killed. And there's a real concern that those who can't leave now will be killed in the same way. And these killings have pervaded videos on TikTok and Telegram. Again, frighteningly easy to see these videos of Azerbaijani soldiers chopping off limbs, beheading people, exposing genitals, carving things in bodies, placing severed heads onto the bodies of animals. And then we've also seen forced displacement. We saw it certainly not, now I think there's no question that there's been forced displacement when you have over 100,000 people who've been systematically removed from the region. But there have been shelling civilian areas. And I do want to highlight that this is not only happening in Nagorno-Karabakh. This is happening along the border in Armenia, in sovereign Armenian territory, where Azerbaijan has shelled communities, tourist areas, cemeteries, churches, used cluster munitions in civilian areas. So what's been taking place in Nagorno-Karabakh is now bleeding into Armenia, and it's a real cause for concern.
Thank you, Thomas. That's really harrowing summary and account of what you have been documenting. And I want to come back to you, Sheila, if I may, as an international criminal law lawyer, as one who's been in the jurisprudence for quite a while. Can you help us understand, the different sort of labels that have been thrown around with respect to these very serious, very grave human rights violations, and how we might think about them under international law, understanding that the categories, right, are sometimes not perfect for capturing the gravity of what's happening. But, Thomas describes the systematicity, and there's the widespread nature of it. So what are the crimes do you think that are at issue at the moment under international law for which there must be accountability?
Thank you. The big one at the moment is this, right after, even during the, I'm going to say exodus. I don't know why some people are upset with the use of that term. It is an accurate description of what happened during the deportation. Azerbaijan was coming out and saying, no, we're going to take care of you. Why are you leaving? Or just basically trying to make this sort of show of we have every intention of guaranteeing the rights and securities. This for the purpose of stating that the displacement was voluntary, and that is very pinpointed, calculated, because that is the element, that is the very element, the use of force that they claim requires basically holding a gun to someone's head. And barring that, it's not ethnic cleansing, or it's not displacement, or force. It's not force. It's just legally wrong. We have jurisprudence that shows lesser coercive environments that amount to the kind of force that you need to find a case of either forcible transfer or deportation, the difference merely being whether they cross an international border or not. So in this case, we have the crossing of 100,000 plus refugees of an international border under conditions that are so coercive, so clearly coercive. I mean, the Prosecutor versus Sheshel is a case I worked on. I drafted that jurisprudence. I know it by heart. And in that case, the Croatians had an opportunity. It was coercive, but they swapped homes before they had a chance to actually have a home to go to. They didn't want to do it. They shouldn't have had to leave, but there was such an anti-Croatian environment coming out of, Vojislav Šešel's anti-Croatian sort of sentiment that it created a situation that's impossible for someone to stay and feel safe. So the group left. And this is a situation where the elements are present. We have deportation as a crime against humanity. We have persecution as a crime against humanity, persecution on ethnic grounds, persecution, the violation of the right to security is also a persecution. And the element, the qualification of what happened during the 9 months as genocide is one that I agree with. Okay, Luis Moreno Campos' report, I think, was strong, and I mean the conclusion is strong. There has been so much anti-Armenian hatred. This kind of hate speech is exactly the kind of speech we see in the Rwandan context that shows the intent to commit genocide. And then you need the acts. And with those acts, like that blockade was clearly aimed at weakening the Armenian group in such a way that I mean, they don't make it a secret that they don't believe that we have a right to exist. This is not something that is a surprise. But for whatever reason, the use of the G word turns so many people off because it's the only crime for which a real legal obligation to act exists, like an actual legal obligation. The rest falls under R2P. So if it's a crime against humanity, there isn't really this like document that says you have an obligation to prevent this. But under R2P, there's a moral obligation, there's a political commitment. I mean, I don't want to step on Juan's toes because that's definitely his area of expertise. But yeah, we've got real crimes. I mean, sometimes when people ask me to describe the human rights violations that have occurred in the context of Karabakh, I'm almost like, they're not just human rights violations, they're crimes. Can we call them crimes? And at the moment, we also have, I wanted to just top up what Thomas said, a very real, not just risk, it's already started, the destruction of our cultural and religious heritage. So rich and sacred. All those churches that are about to be, like, I can't even think about it. I can't even say it, This is from 3rd century. This is our identity. And once you destroy that, I know that cultural genocide is not, part of the Genocide Convention, but that was taken out for political reasons. Raphael Lemkin wanted it in there because it actually will decimate our identity in a way that's almost irreparable. How do we recover from this? All those miscarriages during the blockade, all the soldiers that we lost. I mean, those were going to be fathers. How are we going to recover from that? I'm going to cry.
Thank you. Take your time. So as Sheila was just, identifying for us, some of the most serious grave human rights abuses, we do call international crimes, right? Because they are connected to certain contexts. And with genocide, as Sheila was just noting, when it comes to destruction of cultural heritage, for example, what we're talking about is evidence that from which can be inferred genocidal intent, right? So the specific intent to destroy a protected group in whole or in part, and an ethnic group is particularly one of those protected groups under international law. And as Sheila rightly noted, especially when it comes to genocide and genocidal intent, there is a clear hard duty under international law for intervention. And R2P, we're referring there to the responsibility to protect, which is a doctrine that has been debated for many years. And some would say is moral political obligation rather than a legal obligation. With respect to other types of crimes, like crimes against humanity that Sheila was noting, is also present, where we see widespread and systematic attacks directed against civilian populations. Thomas, did you want to add anything further to what you're seeing in terms of international crimes or just serious human rights abuses for which there needs to be accountability?
Well, I mean, I certainly listed several right to life violations, torture, arbitrary detention. I won't go through each of the legal instruments that provide these protections, but I did want to jump on something that Sheila had said, that Aliyev has said, why leave? Stay here. We'll treat you like Azeri citizens, which is shocking because Azerbaijan, boy, I would not want to be a citizen of Azerbaijan either. The rights abuses, I mean, this is one of the most repressive nations on the planet. This is a nation that ranks so low on the bottom of freedom in the World Freedom Index. I mean, this is a really problematic place. So, on one hand, he does have this discourse of, stay, I'll treat you like my own citizens, which that's nothing to be really excited about. But then, as Sheila's mentioned, the other discourse, the really genocidal language that you hear that mimics that of the Rwandan genocide, the Holocaust, is utterly frightening. The thing about this that's been really troublesome for those of us who've been working on this for a while, my poor students, I beat them to death with a silly analogy of the frog in water. You put a frog in water, boiling water, it jumps out instantly. If you put it in lukewarm water and slowly turn up the heat, eventually it'll sit there and boil to death. And a lot of the abuses that have been taking place over the last several years have been incremental. So it's gotten a little bit worse. And each time we went to Nagorno-Karabakh or Armenia, it seemed to be a little bit worse. And then there was the blockade, which just absolutely suffocated the population. And Luis Moreno Ocampo has talked about how, the genocide, they were carrying out genocide through this blockade. Now they're carrying it out through bombs. They bombed Nagorno-Karabakh. Now the explosion, the boiling has happened. And, we're quite afraid that it might be too late. Certainly the people have been displaced and ethnically cleansed from the area. But a big concern, and I think a conversation that needs to continue past just Nagorno-Karabakh, is whether this will bleed into Armenia. And it has bled into Armenia. And the discourse of the leadership really certainly points to that direction, that this is Armenia, border villages are next. And according to Aliyev, Yerevan is next. So it's quite a frightening situation.
Thank you, Thomas. And I would agree with you that there is echoes here or patterns that we've been seeing with the massive, forced displacement, deportation from Nagorno-Karabakh into Armenia with Srebrenica. For those of us that worked on that case in the former Yugoslavia, where you had a very specific, substantial part of a group, being ethnically cleansed from a specific territory and removed wholesale, right? In a very coercive circumstances, maybe not directly pushing them across the border, right, and forcing them physically, but the coercion around, the fleeing. Professor Mendez-Juan, we've been talking about the duty to prevent and how that exists, particularly when it comes to genocidal situations. And this year we are marking the 75th anniversary of the Genocide Convention. And there's widespread some support and commitment for that treaty. We have about 153 states that are states parties at this point out of 192 UN member states. And so they're legally committed and bound under that treaty. And there is this duty to prevent. So as a former, as the former first UN Special Advisor on Prevention of Genocide, can you help us understand a little bit about what that duty entails and, when it's triggered, what the scope of that duty is?
Well, thank you. First, I want to thank the Promise Institute and the UCLA Law School for the opportunity to discuss these things, especially in a situation that is fluid and changing so rapidly on the ground, as our previous speakers have exemplified. It is true that only the Genocide Convention specifically talks about the responsibility of each member of the international community to prevent and to punish the crime of genocide. But it's very clear also that that's unfortunately become the reason why so many people just don't want to use the G word, as Sheila said, lest we have to do something about it. In the case of Darfur, for example, Secretary of State Powell called it genocide, and then in the next phrase said, but we don't need to do anything about it. So even that becomes just an excuse for inaction. And there's plenty of reasons in every case for not taking a very difficult path to protect people. But I would also say, like Professor Antonio Cassese in his report on the Commission of Inquiry in Darfur said, that there is no hierarchy between genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing. All of them elicit from the international community a response. And yes, in some cases, the response is the obligation is more moral or more, political. But with genocide, it's also black and white letter of the law. Why we cannot identify a situation in which a population is at risk and requires from the rest of us some urgent response. I think it has to do with this sense that calling something genocide does elicit a response, but in the end, as I tried to say, there's so many ways of escaping that obligation. Nevertheless, I think the obligation to prevent has to be seen in practical terms on what helps to prevent. Even if genocidal acts are already occurring on the ground, there's still a duty to prevent their deterioration into worse atrocities. And we don't need to decide that it amounts to genocide with all the different elements of the definition, including the very difficult one of the specific intent that you described a moment ago, Hannah. The specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a community designated by race, religion, national origin, and ethnicity. Even if we don't have all the elements, we need to act before, because if we wait until all the elements are there, then very likely we will not only will not have prevented it, but it'll be too late to even stop the machine of destruction into wholesale genocide. So the creation of the Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide was designed precisely to anticipate what might happen, and even if in the end it doesn't happen, that's all the better. But just the possibility that a population may be at risk that is designated by those elements should and must prompt us to act. And then that's what we call early warning in this context. But early warning has to result in early action as well, because if otherwise, just waving a red flag is not enough to fulfill the duty to prevent genocide. And I think early action depends on understanding situations on a fluid basis and a dynamic basis, and to identify actions that are conducive to prevention and that may need to be changed as events on the ground change as well. And I think it's the early action has to be focused, as I said, on a dynamic and changing way, but on 4 major areas. One is protection of people from harm, from direct harm, if necessary with civilian or with police or military presence that prevents acts of violence against them. The second one is humanitarian assistance, because by and large, in all genocides, there has been elements of starvation or lack of medical attention, etc., displacement, and facilitating humanitarian assistance also has a way of being witness to what's going on the ground and having an effect on at least delaying and perhaps even deterring further acts of violence. The third one is accountability, because by then some very serious acts have already happened, and letting them go unpunished is a way to encourage their repetition. And so we need to find ways in which serious crimes like extrajudicial executions, torture, disappearances are properly investigated and action to prosecute and punish perpetrators is established. Now, obviously, the first obligation is in the territorial state, but if the territorial state is unwilling or unable, then the international community has to provide for breaking the cycle of impunity, because otherwise the violations just simply escalate. And the final area is the underlying conflict that has to be resolved. And of course, that depends on what the conflict is about. But I would just end this part at least by saying that the excuse that this is ultimately a territorial dispute or a dispute about secession and separatist forces, and the recognition that that territory is part of the sovereign territory of Azerbaijan is irrelevant to the fact of how the conflict is being, quote unquote, resolved. There may be a right not to let the territory be splintered and broken up, but the one right that there is not in international law, and it's clearly forbidden, is to repress those tendencies by means of very serious violent acts and starving the population and generally producing what very clearly at first sight constitute genocidal acts.
Thank you. That was so helpful and comprehensive. And I want to follow up with your analysis on what the duty to prevent entails under international law, to ask about your specific report that you issued in August with regard to Nagorno-Karabakh, where you were doing an assessment of the risk factors that are present. And it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, but with the development around and understanding and consciousness among states around the duty to prevent under the Genocide Convention, there have been certain states and the UN have developed tools, right, for helping states to understand when their obligation to prevent is triggered, so that there isn't, in some way, failure to act under the pretext of not understanding exactly when that duty is triggered and what. So there are frameworks now under the UN and in national systems. Some states have them for identifying the risk factors. And when you see those risk factors, that makes clear that you have an obligation to act. So can you tell us specifically what you were seeing, what in sort of was incentivized you in your position of expertise as a former, special advisor on prevention of genocide, to issue, your report warning of some of these risk factors? What were they? What were you seeing?
Well, in August, we already had several months of interruption of the communication and transfer of goods between in the Lachin Corridor. Which the ICRC and other humanitarian organizations were clearly saying that they were producing a humanitarian crisis within the territory of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. The lack of access to food, the lack of access to medical attention, etc., was in itself a very clear warning sign. But in addition, there were expressions of hate and even warnings of more decisive action by the government of Azerbaijan that could not and should not have been, discarded or minimized. I also think that placing a whole population of designated territory under those conditions came very close, at least, to the definition of genocide, at least of the 5 genocidal acts that are described in the convention. The third one on creating conditions of life designated to the destruction in whole or in part. Difficulty with that is that the very word designed to harks back to the specific intent. And so we're in this this vicious circle of saying, well, until I don't see the smoking gun of the intent to destroy in whole or in part, it's not genocide. Now, obviously, that smoking gun is very seldom in place. And so the Genocide Convention cannot be interpreted as meaning that there's no genocide unless there's a ample evidence of specific intent. The conditions of life to which the inhabitants of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh were placed throughout 2023 constitute enough warning. Unfortunately, the events have taken over what I said on August 23. And I don't think I was particularly prescient. I mean, you could see this about to happen or going to happen, and inaction by the rest of the international community only promoted the actions that came later, like the military attack, the detention of leaders of Artsakh, and the lack of transparency about their fate and what's happening to them. All of that Sheila and Professor Becker have described, in terrible detail. But I want to stress that the fact that the worst is happening does not excuse the rest of us from doing what we can to prevent it from deteriorating even further. And there's still plenty of actions that the international community must take to protect the people who are in this very dire situation.
Thank you very much. And we'll talk a bit more about that as well in terms of accountability that you mentioned before as well, when we talk about the duty to prosecute and to hold perpetrators accountable, and efforts that could be made in that direction moving forward. But before we turn to that, I would like to just spend a moment talking with you, Dr. Ashram, about the context of what's happened in the Lachin Corridor and since and prior, since the attacks and the war in 2020 and the attacks subsequent to that. As we've been hearing and we've been talking about here already, with the steady buildup and then the forced displacement and deportation from Nagorno-Karabakh, states and the international community have failed to intervene and to prevent so far. Can you help put these developments for us in historical context and help us understand the link and the continuity from the early 20th century and the genocide to what's happening today? And also, as a second part to that question, talk a little bit about Turkey's role in the current crisis, and what you think or predict will likely be the policies of both Azerbaijan and Turkey moving forward.
Thank you so much. It's really a great honor for me here to be with experts. I'm not an expert of international law and not an expert of international relations. I follow the events like you in the media, but as a historian, I might put the real event in a historical context. My question is very simple. How can we relate 1915 to what is happening today? It is clear that all parties to the conflict view the issue within their own frameworks of continuity. For Armenians, the situation is very clear. What is happening now is a new episode added to the tragedies that Armenians have suffered throughout their history. 1915 was a genocide, and the war of 2020 and its aftermath a catastrophe. If not an outright genocide, then uncomfortably close to it. The Turks and Azeris are thus seen as attempting to finish the job they left unfinished in 1915 to achieve the removal of any Armenian political or meaningful demographic presence in the region. The message frequently coming from Turkish and Azerbaijani sides suggests that the Armenians' fear are not entirely unjustified. Aliyev has long claimed that Armenia is Western Azerbaijan, and he clearly has his eyes on some of the Armenian territories. Turkey was a direct party to the 2020 war. In December 2020, Turkish troops took part in the victory ceremony in Baku. In his speech at this ceremony, Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, paid tribute to the Caucasian Islamic Army and its founder Enver Pasha, one of the genocidaires, as well as to Enver's brother Nuri Pasha, the commander of Islamic Army, responsible for the massacre of approximately 10,000 Armenians in Baku, September 1919. Enver Pasha has the status of a national hero in Azerbaijan today. Azerbaijani soldiers wear emblems with the image of Enver Pasha on their arms. And in Stepanakert, the capital of Karabakh, a major street has already been named after Enver Pasha. Based on this, it is entirely feasible to think that Azerbaijan will not only be content with eliminating the Armenian presence in Karabakh, but may also attack Armenia itself for new territories. If this thesis is correct, the end goal of Azerbaijan and Turkey is either to completely eliminate Armenians' presence in the region or to curtail its territories. Armenia and Armenian community have a well-founded fear of annihilation. It is very important to understand this and stand in solidarity with the Armenian people. To continue with Thema as a historian, of course, the lines of historical continuity are rarely so straight. There are other realities that we need to recognize too. Hard as it may be to believe at this stage, but it was the Ottoman government, the genocidaire Ottoman government, that encouraged the establishment of the Armenian state in 1918 and recognized it as first state. Reality then is far more complex than we actually think. The independent state of Armenia was founded in 1918 by virtue of two major historical facts. The first is the Sardarabad victory of May 28, 1918, which is still celebrated today as the founding day of the Republic of Armenia. The second is that it was the genocidal Young Turk government that both forced and supported Armenia to become an independent state. Indeed, the Armenian delegation came to Istanbul in the summer of 1918, signed the Treaty of Batumi, thanked Talat Pasha for helping them establish a state. This is from the memoirs of the Armenians who were in Istanbul in 1918. They report these in their memoirs. Perhaps a third factor should be added. During the massacres and killings from 1914 all the way 1921, no major state came to the aid of Armenians. The famous example you may all know, 1920 November, Wilson sitting in the White House, drawing the Wilsonian Armenia. At the very same time on those territories, Turkish army were massacring Armenian civilians. So this was the other reality. Do these three factors still have any significance today? Yes, they do. Here are the conclusions I would draw. First, Armenians today need to bring the spirit of Sardarabad to the forefront and rely on that spirit. Taking up arms and defending their country to the last man is the most important option in front of them. That said, I have yet to hear a single word about Sardarabad in the discussions, and I found it really perplexing. I'm wondering why Armenians never talk about their victory, about their resistance, about their defense. And this is what made Armenia. And it is lacking in the discussions today. Secondly, an independent Armenia in the Caucasus is in the interest of both Turkey and Iran. Neither Iran nor Turkey want Russia as their next neighbor. This was the initial calculus behind the genocidaire Talat's support for the creation of the Armenian state. Thirdly, we should not delude ourselves about quantity of effectiveness of foreign assistance that is likely to come to Armenians' aid. These are three lessons. And I will say more about the Turkey's policy in another round, maybe. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Taner. We're going to shift to talk a bit about accountability for the atrocities moving forward. If you want to talk a bit about Turkey now, we can do that, or you can bring that in a bit later as you wish.
Of course, I can add some new points. I mean, I'm very pessimistic regarding Turkey's policy towards Armenia because of two major reasons. Number one, it is a very important information that you should know. Azerbaijan controls an important part of Turkey's economy. And the second, Azerbaijan controls an important number of Turkish media. And there are numbers flowing around. Some calls hundreds, some gives exact number 300, something around, that the Azerbaijan paid journalists and some opinion makers in Ankara, 300 around individuals. This number might be exaggerated. But I wonder really if Turkey, even if Turkey wants to develop a different path in the region, whether they can do that, whether because of the Azeri influence in Turkey. And second important point that makes me pessimist is the 100th anniversary of Turkish Republic. In October, we have the 100th anniversary of Republic, and Tayyip Erdogan tries to prove himself as a superior and better leader than Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And he can prove his superiority in foreign policy. And there are two major areas he thinks he can make some gains. One is occupation in Syria, which they already started. So the extension Turkey's border towards inside Syria. And second, a direct land connection with Azerbaijan. As you all know, maybe from history, 1921, when Dashnaks mostly went along with Western powers, Kemalists and Bolsheviks made an agreement, and the Kemalists let Armenia under Soviet control, And in long term, it was maybe detrimental for Turkey's own interest in Caucasus, but I'm afraid that there might be such an agreement today, that Turkey and Russia made an agreement to the price that Turkey get a direct line to Azerbaijan and leave Armenia under control of Soviet Russia. This is the other option. And in that regard, I'm very pessimistic regarding the development in the region.
Thank you, Taner. So in terms of accountability, there have been discussions with regard to direct assistance for Azerbaijan with the current situation in Nagorno-Karabakh and atrocities against ethnic Armenians from countries like Turkey. There's been allegations of complicity, perhaps in the sense that Russia and its peacekeepers, failed to protect, looked the other way, abdicated from their responsibility to protect the civilian population. So we have those allegations with regard to states. But then there's also under international criminal law that, some of us practice in, the focus is on accountability of individuals and often high-level leaders, but also those, on the ground who make possible the perpetration of atrocities. So I want to talk a bit now that we have seen, of course, the unfolding of the ethnic cleansing and the atrocities, what mechanisms are available at this point for seeking accountability for states as entities, but also individuals who we see evidence that they are allegedly responsible, right, for what's happening. And maybe if I can turn to you again, Sheila, and if you can outline for us maybe a little bit of what has been done already, what advocates, lawyers are seeking to do to make sure that the obligation to prosecute under the Genocide Convention, but generally with regard to atrocity crimes, is actually followed up on as a form of prevention.
Thank you. Well, since the 44-day war, the government of Armenia has taken, big steps in trying to seek accountability for what happened then before the European Court of Human Rights and the International Court of Justice. The European Court of Human Rights has always been the sort of the avenue for accountability for that kind of, violation. But it's not enough. It's clearly not enough. And so interstate cases were filed before the ECHR, but the big step came with the ICJ case. That was a really, really big step for Armenia to take. But again, it's a matter of state responsibility. No one goes to jail. This isn't a prosecution, and they don't have jurisdiction over international crimes, which is often misunderstood. So long story short, we for those who don't know, I think everyone knows that Armenia has decided to ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And this is probably the next biggest possible thing that Armenia could do to really show its commitment towards, it's not going to happen overnight, but that's the biggest, most viable avenue of accountability for these sorts of crimes that we could possibly hope for. And I'm really proud of Armenia for having done that. And I think, we can only hope that it will lead to something. We have asked for retroactive jurisdiction, so it will date back to May 2021. That's the main forum. Apart from that, there are some, I'm aware of some efforts towards seeking accountability through universal jurisdiction in places like Germany and Argentina. But what does bother me is I still hear it, I still read it. I think it was Human Rights Watch again that called on Azerbaijan to conduct investigations of, I'm so tired of reading that. It's not possible for, I'll even say even for Armenia to conduct an independent and impartial investigation. Don't leave it to the warring parties. Don't call on this. It's nonsense. It's really a shirking of responsibility on the part of the international community to step in and take over that part. That's what the ICC is for. But the ICC will take a while. Of course, it's also based on the principle of complementarity. So they're waiting for Armenia, or not Azerbaijan, because it won't be a state party, to conduct the prosecutions themselves. We don't have the possibility of having Azerbaijanis in our custody unless they want to come to Armenia, which, you know, they might, and when they invade us, they tend to do that. But barring that, I think one thing that we still need to work on is trying to get, not through the Security Council, but a Human Rights Council mandated, you know, independent investigative sort of commission of inquiry of sorts, especially in light of what's just happened. If the world can't give us that, I don't understand what's wrong. Like a 3-person panel, can we not just, you know, it's not fair, and it would send a big signal towards like the commitment also towards trying to not right a wrong, because I don't think you can right this wrong, but try to sort of reverse it a little bit and preserve evidence and show Azerbaijan like we're watching you. If they're not willing to sanction Azerbaijan, if they're not willing to put boots on the ground, you can create a 3-person panel that's going to just keep an eye on things, you know. But so far the ICC, I think, is our next big move.
If I can just follow up a bit on what you said with regard to the International Court of Justice and state responsibility, can you help us understand a little bit more about what that case has been about? And, you know, as some of you probably know, there was a couple of orders, provisional measures orders, you know, ordering Azerbaijan, right, to lift the blockade, and nothing was done, right? So there is, you know, and I talk about this with my students all the time, there is this problem that we face in international law around enforcement when we're looking to these international bodies for accountability, particularly when it comes to states, right? So why are you hopeful about the ICJ?
Because, you know, the ICJ case is based only on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which I think is not enough, but it's better than nothing. And, you know, same fact patterns anyway. We have a few provisional measures orders in place. The most significant one being the lifting of the Lachin blockade. And, you know, in 2 days, there's going to be a hearing for the next round of, there's like a sheet of maybe 10 provisional measures requests based on what just happened. But I don't think that it was a failure. That provisional measures order was so strong, it was reiterated. And in every single statement calling on Azerbaijan to whatever, you know, condemning Azerbaijan, if we can even say that, that statement was always, that provisional measures order was always referred to. And the world has taken notice of Azerbaijan's shirking of the order. It's not well received. It's not a good look, and the case isn't over. The case is not even like that kind of behavior strongly suggests that Azerbaijan does not understand the terms of the convention. Do you know what I mean? Like, if they think that they're complying with the order by not complying with the order, how are their arguments to be taken seriously? So I see it as unfortunate that it couldn't be enforced more strongly, but it wouldn't be the first provisional measures order by the ICJ that wasn't respected. This happens, and ultimately, the only thing that you can enforce through the Security Council is a final judgment, not a provisional measures order, because there's still an opportunity for some form of reparation to be made through the issuance of the final judgment. I think I think it was a good step to show how much of a lack of faith or bad faith comes on the part of Azerbaijan in its approach to international law and the international, you know, legal order. And it was important that the world see that. It's unfortunate that it had to come to this, but you know, if you look at the long game, it's not over, and you know, I still think we have a case under the Mercenaries Convention. I think we have a case under the Genocide Convention, but I'm not the one who makes these decisions. So
Well, thank you for ending on that hopeful note. And I really will be watching the proceedings at the International Court of Justice closely, and we'll be seeking to support where we can. I think we've come to the end of our time here, and I just want to thank you all again for providing answers to some of these questions. We're going to open it up now, I think, for Q&A, and Anne is going to lead us in that, along with Hasmeek, who has been monitoring the questions that have come in online.
Can I add one point that I
Absolutely.
missed actually? Then we can start. There is an important aspect from the legal perspective. I make it very short. Armenia need to create an excellent inventory of the properties in Karabakh area. This will be the next legal battle. I know Turkey will advise Azerbaijan to follow the legal path Turkey did after 1922, 1923. And this will be a serious legal battle. I know what the argument of Turkey and Azerbaijan will be in that regard. And I don't want to go into detail, but important thing is to have an perfect list of inventories of Armenian properties in Nagorno-Karabakh. This is really crucial for the next legal fight.
Thank you for that. That's really important. Anne, do you want to take it over?
Great. Thank you so much. So we have, are you able to hear me? We have some of our staff running around collecting questions from you. A great many questions are coming in already. So thank you so much. What an amazing, comprehensive discussion you have had. I think this has educated all of us, certainly myself, not being an attorney, but I think this has been illuminating to so many of us. Well, here is a question that you've begun to describe a little bit, Sheila, in particular, but same with the others. What are there feasible steps that Armenia, the Republic of Armenia, can take, or Armenians at large, to get Azerbaijan to be sanctioned in the way that Russia was sanctioned for its invasion of Ukraine, and the way other countries have been sanctioned for their acts of aggression of this sort?
I think Armenia, the government of Armenia, is doing everything that it can in that respect. But it's really up to the governments that will be providing those sanctions to take the necessary action. And there are many independent endeavors in that, or initiatives to try to convince the United States. The EU is hard because you need a consensus of all 27 member states, but I think you can have individual countries issue sanctions. And I would say if there's a more concerted effort towards trying to get, and this doesn't have to come from the Armenian government at all, the UK to impose sanctions would be really powerful, because there's so much money, Azeri money there. But it's one of the hardest things. Look, a year ago, whenever I would say sanctions to any diplomat, they would laugh at me. They would laugh like, how naive little girl, Now they don't laugh anymore. Now they actually take it. They're like, oh yeah, okay. And the European Parliament just passed a very strong resolution. I mean, it's not binding, but still the word is in there. I think that sanctions are now part of the conversation, and we have to keep that conversation going. So I would encourage us all to keep saying sanctions.
Thank you. We have another question that, in fact, to some degree was touched on in an event that the Promise Institute for Human Rights had, in fact, a couple of years ago. It was after the 2020 war. What are the remedies that international law might provide to promote the restoration of Artsakh Armenians to live on their ancestral homeland? So we might be talking about the notion of remedial secession, so to speak, but, to go back. Perhaps one of our panelists might be able to comment on that. Or I don't know, does one do even remedial secession after the wholesale ethnic cleansing? Is another question.
I mean, I'm not a legal aspect, but I can expert, but I think I would invite everybody on a realistic path. We have here a similar problem like the Palestinians, refugees, 1948. We have a similar problem like the Syrian refugees. Maybe most of you don't want to hear it was the Azeri refugees, 1993. I mean, this is one of the standard refugee problems. And of course, according to international right, they have all the right to return. And you will hear from the Azeri government. This was the reason that I raised the issue with the properties. Azeri government will say they are all welcome to their homeland, but then they will say, these are now some sentences from 1922. We accept only individual basis of return, but after a security check, and this security check will take a long period of time, and they will put a deadline. Whoever applied before until this deadline might come, but before that they will ask to renounce the Armenian citizenship, because according to Azeri citizenship, they don't accept dual citizenship. So welcome to legal fight in a very, how they call it, usual way, and we have to get prepared for this. And in every inch, this is a fight to go back. And I don't think that the Armenians would go back to their, how you should really live under a genocidal state, or a state that has this intention that makes it very clear of all these intentions. So there is a new path of legal fight that we should be ready to go.
Thank you. Perhaps we could ask a couple questions regarding what was referred to the cultural destruction of the monasteries, some of which, hearken from the 4th century, documentation that has been made of all the destruction that took place in Nakhichevan. There are groups, scholarly groups, in fact, that do monitoring, satellite-based monitoring and documentation of what has happened, in fact, to the acquired Artsakh land after the 2020 war. Would any of our speakers care to comment on, legal remedies if this kind of desecration or renaming and revamping of these historic cultural heritage sites as Azeri or Caucasian Albanian or whatever they want to call them? Are there legal remedies to this? I don't know. I'm looking at maybe Thomas or
Thomas, would you like to weigh in on this one?
Sure. I may hijack it and take it in a slightly different direction for 1 second, because I think that, we've talked about genocidal intent, and I think this is another example of the intent to erase the history of Armenians. We spoke to people, so we've documented as much as we can. I mean, we struggled to document the destruction of churches and other religious relics. But they've also, Azerbaijan has done really interesting things where they've even, they've lobbied Google to change the names of churches. We spoke to someone who built a church, and now if you look on Google Maps, this church is an ancient Albanian church. This church was built 30 years ago by someone in Artsakh that we had interviewed. So they've been really successful at reinventing this story. They've been very calculative about destroying carpets. We interviewed the largest museum of Artsakh art and carpets, and they've gone through, and there's videos of them showing basically retelling stories of the carpets, things that had obviously nothing to do with what the people who had created them, but they've really done an excellent job at erasing history. And I think this goes back to the intent that I think as you know, Professor Mendez points out, everyone wants to see the smoking gun, but I think, boy, there are a lot of signals that are coming just shy of that smoking gun that the intent is there, including, you know, Sheila had mentioned this as well, all the genocidal language that mimics that of the Rwandan genocide, of the Holocaust. I mean, explicitly saying that these are cancers, these are tumors, Armenians are tumors, this is a disease that must be eradicated, producing a stamp, quite literally eradicating or cleansing Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think that there's also that part of the erasing of the culture is that intent that that people are looking for.
Thank you. Perhaps we could just have a response to questions that pertain to peacekeeping, right? Obviously, the Russian peacekeepers were completely impotent over the last 10 months. Maybe we'll put it that way. But what about the prospect of at least getting international UN-based peacekeepers there to prevent any further aggression into the sovereign territory of the Republic of Armenia? Is that something that requires unanimity in the UN Security Council, for example, and which would be opposed by Russia? Maybe somebody could comment on that.
Professor Mendez, would you be willing to weigh in?
Well, peacekeeping can be ordered by the Security Council, not by unanimity, but certainly without any negative vote by any of the 5 permanent members, and that's that may be an obstacle that's difficult to overcome. But it can also happen through the consent of the territorial state, and many times it happens just because the Security Council insists, you know, and because the next step would be, you know, more, you know, sanctions or even non-consensual deployment. For example, in Darfur, there was deployment and there was never, you know, it happened because of the consent of the Sudanese government. So there are many different steps in the negotiation process that can result in some effective peacekeeping process. But ultimately, the peacekeeping happens through the Security Council, either by forcing the negotiation or by you know, adopting a decision under Chapter 7 of the Charter against or despite the lack of consent of the territorial state. Now, for a variety of reasons, including the veto powers of some of the permanent members, it's going to be difficult to do this. But in the process, you know, you can build a form of response to the attack on the population at risk there, and even at risk across the border as well. So it's important to pursue all of those things, including, though it may sound naive, insisting that Azerbaijan also has obligations, and obligations to, if not to investigate, prosecute, and punish the perpetrators, because they're not going to do it, at least to identify and to be open to serious monitoring of conditions of detention, for example, of the people who are detained, of the status of property, as a professor mentioned. All of those things are part of what I call accountability. It's not only criminal accountability of individual perpetrators, it's also accountability in a more holistic sense to trying to at least redress in part the suffering of the people who had to leave everything that they had behind, and including their cultural heritage, but not, but also their individual property. I think I fully support that accountability includes reparations, and it includes the return of property, and so an inventory and a clear determination of the status of the of properties, including properties of cultural heritage, is something that we can insist on. But all of that has to be seen in under the prism of whether it's going to protect the as Artsakh ethnic Armenians from further further actions against them. And in other words, like someone said before, a good measure of prevention is accountability, not letting things be swept under the rug just because the situation on the ground has changed.
Thank you. I think I'll ask Hasmig, our Deputy Director, to read question or two.
Sure. We have a couple of questions from Zoom. And the first one is, can the speakers weigh in on the utility of the Global Magnitsky Law to sanction individual Azerbaijani officials responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other serious abuses in the US, the EU, or other jurisdictions?
I can weigh in.
I'm
on
happy
that.
Oh, no, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, so Global Magnitsky is a law that, has been passed here in the United States that allows for civil society groups to put together submissions that identify individual perpetrators, but also corporations and entities that are alleged responsible for very serious human rights abuses. And you can submit these and call upon the State Department, the Treasury to impose certain sanctions, financial and also related to travel and visas against particular individual perpetrators. And certainly, this can be an effective tool. It is something that my students and I have worked on with regard to Cameroon and made several submissions and use it as a tool to continually bring up before the US government the need to take action in a particular situation. While, we haven't been successful with those exact sanctions, they often lead to other action and pressure by the US government. For example, withdrawal of trade status, preferred trade status, withdrawal of defense funding. Oftentimes Magnitsky sanctions are kind of seen as the heavy hammer, as we've been told, and sort of the last resort. But I think certainly it should be used in this instance and submissions should be made. And Thomas, do you want to add anything to what I've said?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in some ways, we've been talking about different international fora, the ICJ, the ICC, the European Court. I'm going to take off my lawyer hat for a moment. I'm a litigator. People think of me as a litigator. I just finished a case about a week and a half ago against the ex-president of Bolivia. It took 16 years, and accountability in these fora can take a long time. And I do think there's lower hanging fruit. I think the Global Magnitsky Act, on the one hand, is challenging, but I do think that the signaling it does, the political signaling it does, can be really helpful. I think there's other avenues. There's the Foreign Assistance Act, Section 502B, which basically says, the U.S. should not be, it prohibits the U.S. from giving security or military and arms sales to countries that carry out human rights violations. So I think that there are, I don't want to say lower hanging fruits, but it's, you don't have to commit to years and years of a legal process. I think there are ways to put pressure on Azerbaijan. I think really, I mean, this is the advocacy hat I'm wearing rather than the lawyer hat, but look, Europe is buying a lot of gas from Azerbaijan. They stopped buying from Russia because they've invaded Ukraine. I think it's time to shame the countries that are now buying from Azerbaijan as they ethnically cleanse Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think these are, I don't want to say lower hanging fruit, but I don't think we just have to be lawyers. I think we can be advocates, and there's a lot of space for those of us who are, or folks in this room or participating that are not lawyers, that are not going to go to the ICC to do something and to really move the needle. And I think there's a lot of space, because when you have a country being so egregiously open about their intent to eradicate ethnic Armenians from Azerbaijan, from Nagorno-Karabakh, who are carrying out widespread abuses, where you can, like I said, see videos of Azerbaijani soldiers beheading people. This is a really easy in some ways, easy thing to sell. They're not making it that hard for us to do advocacy around this. So I think things like the Global Magnitsky Act, the Foreign Assistance Act, and naming and shaming, particularly those who are buying gas from Azerbaijan, are ways that we can get involved, or non-lawyers can get involved in this struggle.
Thanks. And I would just add on to that, what we've found is using these tools for advocacy, for applying pressure, not necessarily resulting in the results we're asking for, but actually applying pressure to get other important results, and also doing it multilaterally. Like, so we have found that countries around the world increasingly are enacting legislation like global Magnitsky legislation. So you have that in, different countries in Europe and Canada. And so like has been done around China and the Uyghurs, you can, submit these to multiple countries around the world that, and call for sanctions and shame them. And it's a targeted multi-pronged advocacy approach.
I like to say that throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, honestly.
And also keep doing it, because it's not like one submission that's gonna change anyone's mind. It's keep pushing that button until someone hears it.
Thank you so much. We have so many really excellent questions, but I think we really only have time for one more. And this pertains to the hostages that have been taken by Azerbaijan. Ruben Vardanyan, former leader of Artsakh, David Babayan, I referred to, was here in this room barely a year ago. What can be done for these individuals who are now being tried in what seems to be perhaps a kangaroo court type of situation? What can be done on their behalf from the international perspective or Armenia's perspective?
The first thing is not forget them. And I think just by naming them today, you've done a big service to their well-being and to their safety, and perhaps to their prompt release. I think there's plenty of scholarship on genocides in the past that shows that sometimes just killing leaders or imprisoning leaders of a community is a step towards determining that genocide is actually happening. And so forcing the issue of access to them, access to their legal situation, making Azerbaijan show what kind of criminal acts they may be charged with, and ultimately allowing ongoing monitoring on site. Not only on detentions and the conditions of detention, but also on the humanitarian relief to the Artsakh residents who remain there, and the status of property and things like that. If we can force the issue of transparency in all of these things, we may be going some part of the way, at least, into preventing further damage and hopefully getting some redress as well.
Thank you, Taner.
Again, another history lesson. 1924 in Lausanne Agreement, there was a special clause. It is the amnesty clause, and I'm sure it will be part of negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan to have a general amnesty, but it will include also the war crimes, unfortunately, and those who are now in detention in Azerbaijan. So a general amnesty for the crimes before, so that they can be released, and then those terrorist Karabakh Armenians could have the legal possibility to return. This is a sword with both sides, and this will be, I am sure that this will be one of the next point of negotiations between both countries.
Okay, thank you. Hannah, maybe I'll turn it back over to you for some closing comments. I'm so sorry.
and it explains everything else since then, including the last 3 years. So I ask that you keep this.
Okay, so our audience on Zoom didn't hear your question. So the question pertains to Pan-Turkism and over the last more than 100 years, the impact that that has had on Armenians and other Christian minorities as well. So anyone would like to comment on that?
Pan-Turanism was an ideology of young Turks, but it is a disputed topic among historians whether or not young Turks followed a military strategy based on their Pan-Turanist ideologies. There was only a very small opening in the history. This is the collapse of Soviet Union and until collapse of Ottoman Empire, 1 year period where Enver Pasha with this Turkish Islamist army tried to follow and Pan-Turanist policies. The military historians, I mean, I don't want to turn here into a military and a history lesson, but the historians have serious doubt that young Turks throughout the First World War followed an aggressive Pan-Turanist military strategy. They believed their military strategy were mostly has a defensive character. This is a long topic, and we should also not forget the realpolitik ideology. Yes, they always use this rhetoric, Pan-Turanism, getting united with Central Asia, but at the same time, it was this Pan-Turanist government acknowledged the existence of Armenian state, also because of the realpolitik. We have a dual relations there. They don't follow only their ideological things, they do sometimes realpolitik also.
Thank you very much. All right, now, Hannah, I'll turn this over to you.
So I want to say again, a deep thanks to all of you, Professor Mendez, Professor Becker, Sheila, Professor Akshman. I just really want to thank you so much for taking time with us and really helping us to explore at a deeper level what more needs to be done for prevention and for accountability moving forward. And I want to thank each of you for coming tonight and spending your time to think about and to understand better these issues and for your thoughtful questions. Coming from the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law, we are deeply committed to accountability, to justice. We stand in solidarity with refugees and are looking for ways in which we can move the ball forward and on some of these strategies that we've discussed tonight. And I just want to flag for you that I'm working with a former student on a letter to the Biden administration calling for action to be taken, including global Magnitsky sanctions and withdrawal of military aid from Azerbaijan. So be on the lookout for that. And we will be seeking institutional signatures and then, posting on our platforms. But in the meantime, thank you again so much. Feel free to reach out anytime for further questions, and I'll hand it back to you, Anne.
Great, thank you. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to our speakers, remote, Thomas, Juan, and Tanner, and Sheila for coming all the way from Armenia. Thank you to Hannah for moderating this really magnificent and very thought-provoking panel. I'd also like to mention for those in the audience here or those remotely, some of you may be wondering, how can we help to personally support the 100,000 plus refugees who have escaped into the Republic of Armenia? Most of you from the Armenian community locally are aware of charitable organizations that are reputable, that have boots on the ground, so to speak, that have been caring for the refugees, to which Sheila had alluded. But if in no particular order, and this is not a complete list, but you may consider donations separately to Armenian General Benevolent Union, Armenian Relief Society, Armenian Missionary Association of America, Fuller Center, International Red Cross, but there are smaller ones such as All for Armenia, the Hidden Road Initiative, Teach for Armenia, the Pados Foundation, so many others. please consider donations and keep donating. Do not forget about our suffering brothers and sisters who have experienced so much trauma and now are attempting to rebuild their lives in a new place. So let me close our webinar by noting that our Promise Armenian Institute, as well as the Promise Institute for Human Rights, have upcoming events that would be of interest to you. Please consult our websites or social media. In fact, a week from today, this evening, in this room, as well as on Zoom and YouTube, we are delighted to welcome Mr. Garo Paylan to UCLA, among the very few ethnic Armenians elected to the Turkish parliament. And so he will be bringing perspectives to us. So we hope you will all join us then. Let me also thank our very energetic staff in the Promise Armenian Institute, Hasmik Bagdasarian, Emily Bogosian, Nanor Hartunian, and in the Promise Institute for Human Rights, Natalie Monsanto, Gabby Pedrosa, and many others. So, and our staff from the Armenian Students Association, thank you for your support. We're very grateful. So thanks once again for your attendance. For those here in person, we invite you to join us for refreshments in the lobby. Thank you and have a good evening.
Well done. Thank you so much.